Our guest on today's Perspective is Dr. Kehinde Andrews, the first European professor of Black Studies. He argues that whiteness is a psychosis, that the late Queen of England was the ultimate symbol of white supremacy, that Nelson Mandela was a sellout, and one of the biggest mistakes for the black community in Britain is to integrate in society. He's also fully aware of the clickbait element of his statements that's led to run-ins with right-wing TV presenters and social media commentators, which he says opens up a wider debate on black consciousness. His new book, The Psychosis of Whiteness, released today, and Dr. Andrews joins us on the programme. Kehinde, can you set out, first of all, what you mean, I guess, the fairly dense book into a few words by the psychosis of whiteness?
I mean, simply, it's the way that we talk about race, about the world, that we understand the world, is through this idea of whiteness. And actually, whiteness is not passive. It's not something you can educate out. It is this really deeply dangerous idea, and I use the word psychosis because it's completely irrational. You can't change it. You can't educate it out. And we need these ideas in order to continue to exploit the world through white supremacy. That's it in a nutshell. And
I note in your book, you talk about, you're well aware that it's seen and probably people easily offended by it, but you're saying this is not a generalization. There's a specific type of people you have in mind.
It's more about people. This is about society. So the term psychosis, obviously, and part of the argument is, as black people, we're much more likely to be labeled with this idea of psychosis. But actually, psychosis isn't a objective medical definition. It's really kind of made up based on people's subjective ideas. And my argument is, because we have to live with this crazy world, like when we go to work, the way we have to engage with media, stuff like this, that's what makes us go more insane, right? And it's not us that's the problem. It's actually the wider world and the discussions we have to get into and all the oppressions that we face on a daily basis.
And you mentioned in the book your awareness of basically how the clickbait system can work. Some of the things that you've mentioned that I talked about in the headline a moment ago, say, okay, this will catch the attention. Do you also sit and think, okay, if we're going to get this talked about, I have to edge this in a certain way, so there is that shock factor?
Yeah, I mean, look, the whole point of radical work is to provoke, right? And so actually, I know the term psychosis is going to get people mad, it's get people upset, well, you can't say that, etc., etc. But actually, these are the kind of conversations that we need to have, because we're talking about race a lot now, after the death of George Floyd in particular, but the conversations we're having are just as bad as the conversations before. In fact, they're worse in many ways, because we think we're getting somewhere when we're not. So actually, what I'm saying is, no, we have to rethink. We need radically new, different ideas. And we need to give up on the idea that we can just educate our way out, seminar our way out, have do one performance or piece of legislation, which is going to get rid of white supremacy. It's far, 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 far worse than that.
It's interesting what you say about, I just want to mention a couple of things that you say which are interesting points counter to the way things are going. For example, you say actually get rid of diversity training routines, saying it actually just makes companies better, take out unconscious bias. So there's a lot of things that you believe actually just are not working within the system. And at the same time, if I can point out, we've had British MPs saying about you that on the one hand, you are happy to address these issues, to raise, to be critical, but at the same time, you criticise institutions whilst taking money, for example, off Birmingham University. Is that something that you feel is a contradiction?
Unfortunately, that's just how it is. I didn't choose to be born here. I had no choice, right? That's how slavery works. It took my family and changed to Jamaica, and now I had to come to this country. And now I find myself in a workplace where, yes, I get paid. But also, in the book, it does have a number of these stories. I also experience racism all the time. And that is what the challenge is when you're in these institutions. And we experience massive racism from the government. I mean, think about the government, this government in particular. I think one of the stories I tell to show the absurdity of this in the book is that they want to address knife crime. And so they decide to target knife-free images on fried chicken boxes across the country, as though black people have some inherent link to knife crime. I mean, this is the kind of nonsense that we have to navigate. And that having to navigate through this nonsense is actually what makes us more mentally ill.
Let me quote a part of the book where you say, the media wonderland's main character is the mediocre white man, typical debate host. We're in the court of the white man, armed with indignant ignorance, utterly convinced that it is they who are correct. Do you have a certain people in mind for that, or is it more general?
Well, I spent a lot of time in the media talking to people, and you're self-accepted, actually. These are quite good questions. But no, I spent a lot of time in these media debates, and people like, I'll name Piers Morgan, because I do name Piers Morgan in the book. But it's not just him, There's a number of, you go into TV shows and you find yourself having discussions of, is Britain racist? So that's a real discussion. I found myself on TV being told I should basically, if I don't like it, I should go home, effectively. And having these conversations just shows you the irrationality. Like, I'm a professor, I kind of know what I'm talking about, but I often get treated as though I just came off the street and just like made things up one day, rather than actually let's have a proper discussion about the issues involved.
But you don't talk about, am I right to say, to paraphrase you, that integration sometimes actually isn't the best way? You talk about actually having a collective interest, and a bit like your university, you said actually there wasn't a need from the institutions to say we must have this course of Black Studies. That was you pushing that and getting an agreement in place to have that in for the first time. But you go further than that. You actually say it needs to change things to actually have a level playing field, as it were. It has to be a revolution.
Well, I mean, this is actually the point of the book. The point of the book isn't individual. It isn't to say white people are psychotic. In fact, there's a whole chapter in the book explaining how black and brown people could just as bad, right? These are ideas that we take in. And when you integrate into a system which is deeply wicked economically, a child dies every 10 seconds because they haven't got food and water, right? We have to say Black Lives Matter because they don't. And when you integrate into that system, you're always going to have to play by those rules. And this is what I'm trying to say. And those rules are psychotic. They are deluded. They are completely irrational. And we can never win that game. So the only way that we can do it is to do something different. Is to have a revolution. Is to build other things. And which is why we said actually in the university, which is one of the whitest spaces, one of the deeply most deluded places with ideas about race, the only thing we could do is create Black Studies, which is a different space, a space, not a separate space, it's an independent space where actually we can do interesting different work. The students have much better mental health in there. We have much better mental health in there. And we make organic links to communities, which just make our work more fulfilling in general.
Something else that jumps out, Kahinder, you say the ultimate white test of a friend is to see if they can get through a black family barbecue alone with no other white comrades to cover fire in a crisis. You said you wouldn't recommend it unless you dislike the person.
Yeah, but this goes back to what is actually a big chunk of the book talks about the idea of segregation and the idea of black spaces. And we get criticized for saying, look, I live in a neighborhood which is 90% not white. I work in a Black studies space where basically all of us are black, right? And we'll be criticized for that, right? Because it's like there's an idea that we self-segregate, we like to be alone, etc., etc. But actually, the people who segregate themselves the most are white middle-class people. In the UK, the vast majority of white people live in areas which are 90 to 95% white. They flee from areas which were like the area I live in right now. When I moved in 30 years ago, lots of white people. As soon as we started to move in, they started to move out. So actually, one of the things you see is that the people who most like to be by themselves are white people, and particularly white people with money. And every time and I've done this a number of times, if you bring in most white people to my area, there is this kind of unease. And this goes back to colonialism. Tropical neurasthenia, the doctor called it. It said actually it's this fear of the natives, this fear of being subsumed. And you see this fear all the time. When in Britain you have politicians saying, Margaret Thatcher said, the fear of being swamped in the UK. It's just that nervousness that you have. We have to, as a black person, I have to deal with being the only black person, sometimes in a building, sometimes in a town, all the time. When you flip that around, you find that people become very nervous and uncomfortable.
Again, very interesting, and swamped words that David Cameron used in Power as well and got him into trouble. Really good to talk to you, Professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University. His book, Psychosis of Whiteness, is out today.